Hey there guys, welcome to another video for They Say I Say. This one's going to cover chapter 3, which talks about the art of quoting, so how we introduce our evidence and such into our arguments. So our goals for this video, by the end, understanding why we quote, and then the really important piece, understanding that quote sandwich and what we mean when we talk about framing quotes. So those are the two things we really want to make sure we're getting out of chapter 3. So first, quoting from sources adds credibility to your argument. They let you show the reader that you are not making things up, but are in fact basing your argument on documented sources. However, source quotes only add to your credibility if you choose sources that are credible and if you are fair in your quoting of them. You want to make sure that when you're using quotes, you're taking quotes from credible sources and that you're using them appropriately, which is what chapter 3 talks about. Just like with everything we've been talking about with They Say I Say, it's always a balancing act. Quoting is something that you don't want to do too much, you don't want to do too little. You must quote enough to support your argument, but not so much that you bore your audience by inundating them with quotes and ideas that are not your own. Remember, when we're assigning you things, when we're asking you to write these arguments, we're asking you for your ideas. We're not asking you just to go read a bunch of other things and pull out quotes. We want to know what you think backed up by those quotes. You also have to remember that quotes cannot speak for themselves. They're like orphans. You cannot assume that the reader will understand the quote as you do. Simply slapping quotation marks around a source's words is not enough. A lot of kids like to do that. It doesn't work. They can't speak for themselves. They need you. So in order to avoid readers misunderstanding your quotes or thinking that you're not credible, undermining your ethos, you have to do two things. First, you have to choose your quotes wisely, and then once you've chosen good quotes, you need to frame them using what Graff and Birkenstein call the quote sandwich. So that's two ways to avoid misunderstanding with quotes. You have to choose good ones. You have to frame every quote. So the first thing you must do is you choose your quotes wisely. The most important thing to consider once you have a credible source is whether the quote supports the claim you're making. A quote's purpose is to support your claims, not just prove that you've read. If a quote doesn't support your claim, it shouldn't be in your paper. No matter how cool the quote is, no matter how funny, no matter how witty, if it doesn't support your claim, it shouldn't be in the paper. We're not asking you to prove you've read. We're asking you to make good arguments. You have to remember, writing an argument at the college level is messy. This is a college level class. It's hard. It takes multiple drafts, multiple revisions. You cannot get locked into a quote. Sometimes you're going to change quotes. Don't try and force a quote to fit. A quote that worked at the beginning of the process might not work as you go on. That's fine. You have to be willing to change. You have to be able to accurately and consistently assess the quotes and sources you're using. You don't want to lock yourself into a quote. What works in the first draft might not work in the second or third draft. You also have to begin to accept that good writing takes multiple drafts. So once you've chosen your excellent quotes from your sources, you're ready to insert them in your argument. You can't simply drop them in your paper though. You have to frame them in the quote sandwich. You don't want to leave them as those orphans. You've got to give them something around them so the readers don't misunderstand. So when you're framing the quote in the quote sandwich, you're sandwiching the quote between two things: an introduction to the quote and an explanation of the quote. The introduction does just that, introduces the quote. Who said it, who they are, like a job title, why are they credible, and then you preview the ideas that the quote supports. The explanation is where you tell the reader what you take the quote to mean. Remember, these quotes can't speak for themselves. You have to speak for them. You cannot assume the reader's going to take the quote to mean the same thing that you do. So it's very important that you have that second part of the sandwich where you say, this is what I think the quote means, because you might think the quote means something than I do. And if I don't know what you think it means, that will lead to a misunderstanding. So if you look at this paragraph right here, you can see what this looks like in a paper. So the writer introduces the source and who she is, Susan Bordeaux, but also that she's a feminist philosopher, which establishes the source's credibility. Then the writer previews the ideas the quote will support, which is increasing the number of women seeing themselves in needs of a diet. Then you get the quote. Finally, this author explains what they take the quote to mean so that the reader knows exactly what the writer believes the quote is saying. This takes away any confusion. It's important to note, this is only part of a good paragraph. This is not the whole paragraph. This is just a piece of, but it's an important piece. While it's possible to over-explain a quote, you should still attempt to make it clear to the reader what you think the quote is saying. They must know what the quote means to you so they can understand your thinking. So don't worry too much about over-explaining. Some quotes are self-evident, but very few actually are. When in doubt, explain what you think the quote means. As we've said before, you'll keep hearing us saying, be careful to avoid the blah words like says, writes, etc. Try to use the word that accurately describes the source, what your source is doing. If they're passionate, then say demands, please, defiantly argues. Blah words bore your readers. They make your readers sick. They make us not want to read what you're writing. So don't say says, don't say writes. Use those words we've given you to avoid using these boring words. So that was chapter 3. Review here. Why quote? Quotes are going to add credibility to your argument. They build your ethos, but only if you choose quotes wisely and from credible sources. You have to balance, remember, how many quotes you use. You don't want too many. You don't want too few. You got to find that Goldilocks area. You want to remember, quotes cannot speak for themselves. You need to explain them. You need to speak for them. That's where the quote sandwich comes in. That's where framing comes in. So you speak for quotes by using framing and by framing every quote in the quote sandwich, which sandwiches the quote between an introduction and an explanation. All right, guys, that's it for chapter 3. As always, this doesn't replace reading chapter 3. You should still read it for more details and some templates on how to do this. And we look forward to seeing you guys in class.